Yeah, welcome to my class again today. We are still on learning operators in Python. So today we are going to look at the last class we did arithmetic operator. So the next one we are going to look at now is logical operators. And what is this actually used for? Combined Boolean values and operators and or and not logical operators. We actually use this most times in electronics too. And I'm going to show you the truth table for these logical operators. Okay, so you can see the truth table for the logical and, as you can see now, is I'm going to declare two variables, which is A and B. Those are the two operands, A and B. Now, if A is false and B is false, A and B is going to return false. If A is false and B is true, A and B will return false. If A is true and B is false, A and B will return false. And if A is true and B is true, A and B will return true. I have actually demonstrated this in one of my classes using the switch. But in this Python class now, I'm actually going to show it to you in a different way. You can actually use this AND operator to test the value of this variable and determine what is going to be returned. Now, the key thing to note in this AND operator and the OR operator and the NOT operator is that the AND operator and the OR operator actually work on two operands, right? The NOT operator works on just a single operand. So the NOT operator is known as unary operator. It works on just a single operand. The AND operator, what it does is this. If we have a value, say this variable A, let me show you practically using the PyCharm. All right, so let's remove this. Now, if I'm going to demonstrate the AND operator, in Python language, 0 is actually referred to as false. And any other number other than 0, which is from 1, 2, 3, like that upward, is considered to be what? True. Looking at the truth table of that AND operator, if the value of the first operand is false, now it is not going to test the second operand. It's going to return that value because from the truth table, it will take only both of them to be true for you to have a truth output. If any of them is false, the answer will be what? False. So what happened? If the value of the first operand is true, right, it is now going to test the second variable, which is the second operand, and it will return the value of that operand. So in this case now, let me use 0 and 1. Let me do 0 and 1. I'll put this one to be 0, and I'll put this one to be 1. Now, for the AND operator, the first thing it will do is it will check A. If A is false, which is 0, if A is false, it's not going to check for B again. It's going to return this false because whatever the value of B will be, it doesn't matter. It is going to return the first one. So what it does is that it checks the first value. If it is false, it will not check the second value. It will return that value first. But if the value of the first variable is true, then it will check the second variable and return whatever the value of that second variable is. Now, this is a bit tricky, but this is actually how it works in electronics. So the first thing you do is it will check the first one, right? If the value is false, it doesn't bother to check the second one. It's going to return a false value, false output. But if it checks that first variable and the value is true, then it's going to check the second variable, which is the second operand, and return whatever value that second operand is carrying, not the value of the first operand. That you must take note. So I am going to show you this. Now, looking at this now, I will say print A and B, right? So what will it return? If I print this, what will it return? Now, it's going to check this one, which is 0, that is false. Now, once it is false, is not going to check B. So it's going to return false, right? It's going to return false. Now, when I execute this, C is going to return 0. It's returning the value of that first operand, which is 0. Now, if I change this one to 1 and I change this one to 0, now what will the output be? The output will still be false, because for it to give us true, it means that both of them have to be true. Now, why is it going to give me false? So it will check this first operand, and it will see that the value of this operand is what? Is true. Then it's going to check the second operand, which is the second variable, and it will return the value of that variable, irrespective of what it is, whether it is true or it is false. That is what it's going to return. So this one will make it go to the second one. So when I run this, it's still going to return 0. See, it's still going to return 0, which is what? The value of B. But when I change this one now to 1, then I run it, it's going to return what? This value of B, which is what? 1. See, that's what it's returning. So what it does is that it checks the first variable for the value. If the first variable is true, it will now check the second variable and return whatever value that second variable is. So if it checks the second variable and it is false, which is 0, it's going to return 0. If you check that second variable and it is now 1, which is true, then it will return that value, which is true. So it's not actually returning the value of the first variable. It's actually returning the value of the second variable, irrespective of what it is. Because for you to understand that is, I'm going to change this to what? To 10. I'm going to change this to 10. And then I'm going to change this to 20. Now, in this now, the value of A is true. So it's not going to return it. It's going to check the second variable and return the value that is there. So you will now see that the value of A is 10, so it will not return it. It will now move to check the value of B and return the value that is in B. So if I execute this script now, it's going to return what? 20. Can you see? It's returning 20. So that is what I mean by saying this is unlike the case of that switch. In that switch, fine. If you use this concept in electronics, it means that "and" simply means that the two switches must be on. If the first switch is on and the second switch is off, it means the output will be off. If the first switch is off and the second switch is on, it means the output will be off. So using it in this concept here is having two variables, a value in one variable, a value in the second variable. So in writing your code, depending on what you want to achieve, right, you can actually use the AND operator. So I say, okay, when this value comes, if it is this value, don't return it. Return this other value. So that is it. So that is what is happening. If both are true, if the first variable is true, don't return it. Check the second variable and return whatever value is in the second variable. That is what this instruction is. Now I'm going to change this to OR operator. So I'm going to change this to OR. Now the OR operator is actually working differently from this, the opposite of the AND operator. Now in the OR operator, the truth table of the OR operator, is if the value is false, the first operand is false, and the second operand is false, it's going to return false. But if any of the operand is true, it's going to return true. So if A is true and if A is false and B is true, it's going to return true. If A is true and B is false, A or B will return true. If A is true and B is true, A or B will return true. This is actually the opposite of the AND operator. So in the OR operator, we are going to demonstrate it. So let's demonstrate it here. Let me change this to A, and let me change this to 1. So the OR operator is saying that when you look at the first operand, if the first operand is false, right, you have to check the second operand. In the case of an operator, it is when the first operand is true. That is when you check the second operand and return whatever value is in it. In the case of OR operator, when the first operand is false, that is when you check the second operand, which is the second variable, and return whatever value is in it. But if the first operand is true, you don't need to check the second one. You return that true value, right? So we are going to look at this now in this OR operator. So A equals to 0, B equals to 1. Now when you run this, the first operand is 0. Now you are going to check the second operand and return the value of that second operand, which is what? The variable A is carrying 0, so he checks it. He's not going to return it. He's not going to check the second variable and return the value of the second variable. So in this case now, he's going to return 1 as my output. Can you see that? It's returning 1 as my output. Now, when I change this to 1, it's going to return 1 as my output. See, still returning 1 as my output. Now, when I change this to 0, what will it return? It's still going to return 1 as my output. So when I click on this, it's going to return 1 as my output. All right. So if I now change this one to real value by saying 10, and then I change this to real value by saying 20. Now, when it checks the first operand, the first one is 10, right? So, which is true. So it doesn't have to check the second variable anymore. It's just going to return the value of the first variable. So if I execute this now, it's going to return 10. So you see, it's returning 10 as my output. Now, if I change this to 0, it's going to return 20 as my output. Because when it checks this, it is false. Then it will now check the second variable and return whatever value is in that one. So when I execute this to return 20, can you see that? It's returning 20 as my output. So that is what the OR operator is. The concept, the information that is in it is what is very important. The concept is what you need to understand. Otherwise, you will run into a problem trying to implement this AND operator and the OR operator in your source code. Okay, so now we are going to look at the NOT operator. Now, the NOT operator is a unary operator, just working on one operand. All right, so I'm just going to say NOT. So print NOT A. Now, if I leave it this way, this 0 is considered as false, right? So when I say print NOT A, it's going to print true. So if I come here and I execute it, see, it's printing true because this 0 is false. So if I change this one to 1 or any other number, and I say print NOT A, it's going to print false. See, it's going to print false. So if I change it to 10, and I say print NOT A, it's going to print false. Because any other number aside 0 is considered as true. So any number I supply to A is going to print the opposite of it, which is what? False. So if I change this one to false, right? This has to be cap lock. And I say print A, print NOT A, is going to print true. So that is all I have to show you as regards the logical operator. So understanding this concept will help you in your code, writing your source code. So in the next class, we are going to look at the identity operator, the membership operators, and the bitwise operators. So till then, see you in the next class.